A 4-star American general told a room full of reporters that the Allied program to purge the defeated regime's loyalists from power was no more serious than a fight between Democrats and Republicans. George Patton, 60 years old, commander of the Third Army, the force that had traveled farther, captured more territory and destroyed more enemy formations than any other American army in the war. The man who'd relieved Bastogne, the man who'd beaten Montgomery to Messina. 5 months earlier, with Germany's surrender still days away, Patton had written his wife a single line: "Peace is going to be hell on me." He wasn't wrong. Peace didn't just bore him. Peace gave him a microphone, a room full of war correspondents, and no battlefield left to make people forgive the things that came out of his mouth. Eisenhower had saved Patton after the slapping scandal in Sicily, saved him again after a careless speech nearly cost him his command before D-Day. This time, there wasn't a war left to make Patton worth the trouble. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. Before the last German unit had even signed its surrender papers, Patton was already working the phones. He wanted the Pacific. There was still a war on, and he intended to be in it. George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, didn't say no. He said something worse. He told Patton he could have a command in the Pacific, but only if the Chinese secured a major port to support operations. It was a condition Marshall almost certainly knew wouldn't be met. It was the polite version of no. So Patton waited, and while he waited, the atomic strikes hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th, and the formalities followed on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri. The last open door in the entire world slammed shut. There was no more war anywhere on Earth, and George Patton was still alive. Now here's the thing you have to understand about George Patton in the summer of '45. This wasn't a man having a rough couple of months. This was a man watching the only version of himself that had ever mattered dissolve in front of him. He'd written his wife Beatrice back in early May, "I love war and responsibility and excitement," and he wasn't being dramatic. He was being precise. War was the only medium he'd ever operated in. Take the war away, and what remained wasn't a commanding general. It was a 60-year-old man with a temper, a pair of ivory-handled revolvers, and nothing left to aim them at. The morning Germany surrendered, May 7th, 4 in the morning, Bradley had called him. "Ike just called me George. The Germans have surrendered." For most of the generals on that phone chain, the sentence landed like relief. For Patton, it landed like a verdict. He later wrote in his diary that he regretted having survived the war. The man who'd driven the Third Army across 600 miles of France in a single summer, who'd turned Bastogne in the dead of winter, who'd crossed the Rhine and punched all the way into Czechoslovakia. That man had just been told his services were no longer required. By war's end, the Third Army had captured over 1,250,000 prisoners and liberated or conquered more than 81,000 square miles of territory. No American army in the entire conflict had traveled farther or hit harder, and none of it, from this morning forward, would matter in the way it had mattered yesterday. And here's where the irony starts to curdle. 3 weeks before that phone call, on April 12th, Patton had walked through the gates of Ohrdruf alongside Eisenhower and Bradley. It was the first camp in the regime's vast system of organized cruelty to be liberated by American forces, overrun on April 4th by the 89th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division. What they found inside was beyond language: emaciated survivors, evidence of systematic extermination on an industrial scale. Robert Murphy, Eisenhower's political advisor, who accompanied the group, later wrote that Patton went off to a corner thoroughly sick. Patton's response was immediate. He ordered civilians from surrounding German towns to walk through the camp and see what had been done under the regime they'd supported. Other commanders across the occupation zone adopted the same policy. Whatever else you could say about George Patton, and there was plenty, in that moment he understood what that regime had built. He'd seen it with his own eyes. He'd vomited because of it. 5 months later, he'd stand in front of reporters and wave the whole thing off as a squabble between political parties. That gap between the general who ordered German civilians to face what their government had done and the general who told reporters that government's party membership didn't matter is the contradiction at the center of everything that followed. With the Pacific closed off, Patton was stuck with one remaining option: military governor of Bavaria. He took the job because there was nothing else to take. The Third Army, his army, the force he'd built into the most aggressive armored formation in the European theater, was now an occupation force spread across southern Germany and Austria. Instead of planning river crossings and armored thrusts, Patton's daily work was municipal administration, water infrastructure, food distribution, refugee camps housing hundreds of thousands of displaced people from across Eastern Europe. Poles, Balts, Jews, Ukrainians, all of them crammed into overcrowded former barracks and hospitals with nowhere to go. And looming over all of it, the massive, politically explosive program of removing former members of the defeated regime's party from every position of authority in Bavarian public life, from cabinet ministers and bank directors down to school teachers, postal clerks, and police chiefs. Every adult in the American zone was required to fill out a detailed questionnaire about their political past. The paperwork alone was staggering. The political stakes were even worse. Patton despised the work. He told anyone who'd listen that the whole process was counterproductive, that firing every German who'd held a party card meant firing the only people who knew how to keep a country running. He wasn't entirely wrong about the administrative problem, and he was catastrophically wrong about almost everything else, and he said so to people who were listening. Now, a different kind of general might have managed this transition, kept his opinions behind closed doors, done the administrative work, waited for a quiet retirement with his reputation intact. Patton was not that general, and everyone who'd served alongside him knew it because they'd watched this exact pattern play out before, twice. The first time was Sicily, August 1943. Patton was commanding the 7th Army during the Allied invasion of the island. He walked into the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia and found Private Charles Kuhl of Mishawaka, Indiana, sitting on his cot with no visible wounds. Kuhl told Patton he was nervous. Patton struck him across the face with his glove and called him a coward. A week later, at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, Patton did it again to another soldier, this time pulling his sidearm during the outburst. Both men were suffering from combat exhaustion, a condition Patton refused to recognize as real. The press corps in Sicily knew. Eisenhower knew. The story stayed buried for months until the columnist Drew Pearson broke it on national radio. The backlash was ferocious. Congress demanded answers. Eisenhower reprimanded Patton privately, ordered him to apologize to every soldier and medical staffer who'd witnessed the incidents, and then, crucially, didn't fire him. Patton was too valuable. The invasion of France was coming, and Eisenhower needed his most aggressive armored commander. So Patton was sidelined, used as a decoy for Operation Fortitude, and quietly held in reserve until the fighting resumed. The second time was Knutsford, England, April 1944. Picture this. It's 6 weeks before the most important amphibious invasion in history. Every Allied commander is under orders to keep a low profile, and Patton walks into a local welcome club and tells the audience that it's the evident destiny of America and Britain to rule the world. He left out Russia, a colossal diplomatic blunder, at a moment when the entire Allied coalition depended on keeping Moscow on board. The fallout was immediate. Marshall and Secretary of War Stimson wanted Patton relieved. Eisenhower drafted a cable removing him from command. He didn't send it. The logic, again, was simple. Patton's mouth was a problem, but Patton's tanks were worth the problem. As long as a war was on, the equation held. So, Eisenhower saved him, twice, and both times the calculation was identical. The value of Patton on a battlefield outweighed the cost of Patton in front of a microphone. What nobody at Supreme Headquarters wanted to confront in the summer of '45 was the obvious follow-up question. What happens when the battlefield disappears and the microphone doesn't? Some people are built as instruments for crisis. Fast, aggressive, indispensable when everything's falling apart. The problem with a crisis instrument is that it doesn't know how to sit in a drawer. It doesn't retool itself for peacetime. It doesn't learn diplomacy at 60. It just keeps swinging, whether or not there's anything left worth hitting. Patton was about to prove that, and this time there wasn't a D-Day 6 weeks away to make him worth saving. The American occupation zone in Bavaria held roughly 9 million Germans. Every single one of them was supposed to fill out a questionnaire, a Fragebogen, 131 questions long, accounting for their political history under the regime, party membership, rank, affiliations, financial connections. The forms arrived by the truckload. The system was designed to sort an entire population into categories ranging from major offender down to follower, and to remove anyone above a certain threshold from any position of public responsibility. On paper, it was thorough. In practice, it was chaos. There weren't enough qualified investigators. There weren't enough translators. There weren't enough replacement administrators to fill the positions being vacated. The backlog of unprocessed questionnaires grew into the hundreds of thousands, then into the millions. Bavarian state agencies ground to a halt as experienced officials were suspended pending review, with no one qualified to take their place. Hospitals lost doctors. Courts lost judges. Municipal governments lost the clerks who knew where the water mains ran. And at the top of this entire operation sat a man who'd made it clear, privately at first, then with increasing volume, that he thought the whole effort was a waste of time. Patton's argument wasn't complicated. He told his staff, and eventually told anyone who'd listen, that the former party members were the only Germans who knew how to run anything. The banks, the utilities, the railroads, the police. Strip them all out, and Bavaria wouldn't function. A military government fiscal officer investigating party-linked bankers in the American zone got the message directly. According to the official US Army history of the occupation, Patton asked the officer whether he didn't think it was silly to try to get rid of the most intelligent people in Germany. The officer, presumably, didn't answer. Raymond Daniel of the New York Times picked up the thread. His reporting that fall laid out the problem in print. Former regime members still held key jobs in commerce and industry across the American zone, and the military government in Bavaria seemed more interested in preserving German efficiency than in achieving the stated goals of Allied policy. The article named Patton directly, and the political fallout wasn't limited to headlines. Friedrich Schäfer, the minister-president of Bavaria, whom Patton had appointed, resigned under pressure over the pace of the removal program, a public embarrassment that landed squarely on Patton's desk. In the upper reaches of the American command, Patton's views on the removal program were already uncomfortably familiar. He'd written Eisenhower a letter back in August, suggesting the Supreme Commander pass a word to the people responsible for civil government to slow the whole process down. Eisenhower hadn't taken the suggestion, so the newspapers were circling, and Patton, rather than pulling back, was accelerating in the opposite direction. The displaced persons crisis made everything worse. In July, President Truman had sent Earl Harrison, a former immigration commissioner, now the American representative on the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, to inspect conditions in the camps across the American zone. Harrison and his team visited roughly 30 camps. What they found was appalling. Jewish survivors of the regime's camps, liberated months earlier, were still being held behind barbed wire in overcrowded facilities, sometimes in the same physical structures that had served as their prisons. Some camps were guarded by former soldiers of the defeated army. Food was inadequate. Sanitation was collapsing. Harrison's report, delivered to Truman in August, was devastating. Its central finding was blunt. As far as the treatment of Jewish displaced persons was concerned, we appear to be treating the Jews as the regime treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. The report hit like a grenade. Truman forwarded it to Eisenhower with a demand for immediate improvements. Eisenhower, who'd personally witnessed the horrors at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald months earlier, was blindsided by the implication that his own occupation forces were perpetuating a different kind of cruelty. He issued sweeping new directives on September 20th, reaffirming that displaced persons were to be treated with dignity and that conditions in the camps were to be brought up to standard immediately. Then he went to see for himself. On September 17th, he brought Patton along. They visited a Baltic camp first, clean, orderly, the displaced persons in folk costume performing dances for the visiting generals. Then they drove 45 minutes to a Jewish camp in the area of the 20th Corps. The contrast was stark. Conditions were far worse, overcrowding severe, the atmosphere nothing like what they'd just seen. Patton recorded the visit in his diary that evening. His private reaction to the Jewish camp was contemptuous and ugly, revealing not sympathy or urgency, but open hostility toward the displaced people themselves and resentment toward anyone who suggested they deserved better treatment. Eisenhower saw the same facilities, rode in the same car, walked the same muddy grounds, and ordered immediate reforms. Patton saw them and resented being told what to do. The gap between those two reactions, in a single afternoon riding in the same car, tells you nearly everything about why the next 5 days would unfold the way they did. And the anti-Soviet rhetoric was getting louder by the week. Patton had been suspicious of Moscow since before the surrender. On the day the war ended, while most American commanders were thinking about demobilization and going home, Patton was thinking about the Red Army. In March, when the Third Army had swept into Germany and crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule, Patton had been furious that Eisenhower's orders stopped him short of Prague and let the Soviets take both the Czech capital and Berlin. He saw it as a political gift to an enemy that hadn't earned it on the battlefield, and he said so in his diary repeatedly, with language that left no room for diplomatic interpretation. By summer, the suspicion had hardened into conviction. Patton believed, and said privately, with increasing force, that the Western Allies had fought the wrong campaign, that the defeated German army, battered and humiliated, was not the threat, that the real danger was the Communist Empire consolidating its grip on everything east of the Elbe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, the Balkans, and that every week the Allies spent dismantling the German state was a week the Soviets used to dig in deeper. These weren't idle complaints. Patton, according to later accounts, went further. He argued privately that former soldiers of the defeated German army should be rearmed and used alongside American forces to push the Red Army back east. He talked about the Soviets as the West's true enemy, openly, on phones that he didn't know were being monitored. Here's where things turned dark. According to accounts published in multiple post-war histories, concerns about Patton's stability had grown serious enough within Eisenhower's headquarters that extraordinary measures were taken. Patton's telephones were tapped. His residence was bugged. A psychiatrist, according to these sources, was posted to his headquarters disguised as a supply officer, tasked with observing Patton's behavior. The wiretappers heard exactly what they expected to hear. A 4-star general talking about provoking a war with America's most powerful wartime ally. In one conversation with General Joseph McNarney, Eisenhower's designated successor as theater commander, Patton reportedly said something to the effect that he could arrange enough incidents within 10 days to start a war with the Soviets and make it look like their fault. Whether the phrasing is exact or a later paraphrase, the sentiment was well documented across multiple sources. Patton wasn't joking, and the people listening weren't laughing. A 4-star general commanding 250,000 occupation troops was talking openly about manufacturing a casus belli against a nuclear-armed ally. What Patton's superiors faced in September 45 was a genuine institutional crisis, and if you step back from the drama of it, the dilemma was almost elegant in its impossibility. Here was a man who, 12 months earlier, had been the single most valuable tactical commander in the European theatre, the man whose Third Army had turned Bastogne when no one else could have moved that fast, the man Eisenhower had personally shielded twice, absorbing political damage both times, because the alternative was losing an irreplaceable weapon. And now that same man was sitting in a governor's mansion in Bavaria, running his mouth to reporters about regime loyalists and to subordinates about starting a preventive war with Russia, while a concealed psychiatrist took notes and a wiretap recorded every word. The question wasn't whether Patton was a brilliant general. Everyone knew the answer to that. The question was what you do with a brilliant general who can't stop talking and who no longer has a war to make the talking worth tolerating. Patton was 5 days away from answering that question for everyone. September 22nd, 1945, a press conference in Bavaria. Patton stood in front of a room full of war correspondents, men from the New York Times, the Chicago Daily News, the New York Herald Tribune, PM, and a dozen wire services. These were the same journalists who'd covered his Third Army's sprint across France, who'd written about his relief of Bastogne, who'd filed stories from the Rhine crossings and the push into Czechoslovakia. They knew Patton. They knew his temper, his profanity, his gift for the kind of quote that made front pages. And they knew, by this point, that Patton as military governor was a different animal than Patton as battlefield commander. Angrier, more erratic, increasingly out of step with the policies he was supposed to be enforcing. Reporters like Victor Bernstein, Ray Daniel, Ed Morgan, and Carl Levin had already been filing stories all summer about the failures of the purge program under Patton's watch. The press corps wasn't here to throw softballs. They were here because they smelled a story. The questions came around to the removal program, the Allied effort to strip former regime loyalists from positions of power across Bavaria. And Patton, rather than offering the careful, policy-aligned answer that any halfway competent staff officer would have scripted for him, did what George Patton always did. He said exactly what he thought. Patton dismissed the entire program with a wave. He didn't see the need for it, he told the room. And then he delivered the sentence that would end his career. The whole controversy over who'd held a party card and who hadn't, in Patton's view, was about as meaningful as a fight between Democrats and Republicans back home. That was it. One analogy, one sentence. The man who'd commanded the most lethal American army in the European war had just compared the political apparatus that had built the concentration camps to the Republican Party of the United States. The room knew immediately. The correspondents had been covering Patton long enough to recognize the difference between a colorful quote and a career-ending one. This was the second kind. Within hours, the story was on the wire services. Within a day, it was on the front page of every major newspaper in the Allied world. Time magazine's next issue didn't hold back. Patton, the magazine reported, military governor of Bavaria, had made a fool of himself and had reflected on the whole US Army by holding a press conference and dismissing the effort to purge the defeated regime's loyalists. Worse, he publicly undercut the policies and orders of his supreme commander, General Eisenhower, who'd staked his authority on making the program work. And here's the thing that made this different from Sicily, different from Knutsford, different from every other time Patton's mouth had outrun his judgment. In Sicily, he'd slapped a private in a hospital ward, awful but containable, and the press corps had sat on the story for months. In Knutsford, he'd said something stupid at a private event where reporters weren't supposed to be present. Both times, there were mitigating circumstances, ambiguities, ways to spin the damage down. This time, there was nothing. Patton had stood in front of credentialed war correspondents, on the record, in his official capacity as military governor of Bavaria, and told them that the defining moral undertaking of the Allied occupation, the removal of the political machinery responsible for the greatest organized atrocity in modern history, was the equivalent of a party squabble in a midterm election. There was no walking it back. There was no "he was misquoted." There was no angle. Eisenhower's reaction was immediate. He ordered Patton to retract the statement. He sent Robert Murphy, his senior political advisor, from Frankfurt to Bavaria to conduct a formal investigation into Patton's administration of the occupation, whether the removal program was actually being enforced, whether former regime officials were still holding positions they shouldn't be holding, and how deep the problem went. Patton tried to fix it. He called the press corps back for what amounted to a retake, a second press conference to undo the first. Picture the scene, the same room, many of the same reporters, and now Patton, a man constitutionally incapable of admitting error, attempting to clean up a catastrophe of his own making. He blamed the whole mess on his unfortunate analogies and on the newspaper's startling headlines. He insisted that what he'd said shouldn't reflect on my commanding officer, General Eisenhower. He acknowledged stiffly that so vile a thing as the regime's ideology could not be got rid of overnight. He shifted in his seat. He chose his words like a man walking through a minefield in dress shoes. None of it worked. The retraction read like what it was: a general under orders reading words he didn't believe, to reporters who could tell the difference. The correspondents filed their stories on the retraction, and those stories were almost worse than the original because they made it clear that Patton wasn't sorry for what he'd said. He was sorry he'd been caught saying it. Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, held his own press conference shortly after. Bedell Smith was everything Patton wasn't in front of a microphone: controlled, precise, and acutely aware of the political temperature in Washington. His message, delivered in the clipped language of a man doing damage control for someone else's disaster, was straightforward. The Supreme Commander's headquarters remained fully committed to the purge program, and General Patton's personal opinions on the matter didn't reflect the policy of the Allied command. What Bedell Smith didn't say, what nobody at Supreme Headquarters was saying publicly was that the machinery to remove Patton was already turning. Murphy's investigation would confirm what the newspapers had already reported, that Patton's administration in Bavaria had been dragging its feet on the removal program from the beginning, that former regime loyalists remained in key positions throughout the state apparatus, banks, courts, municipal agencies, and that Patton's personal contempt for the program had filtered down through his staff into operational obstruction. The military government detachments under Patton's command had been filing incomplete reports, slow-walking dismissals, and in some cases, quietly reinstating officials who'd already been removed. Murphy's cables back to the State Department made it clear this wasn't negligence. It was policy, Patton's policy, running parallel to and in direct contradiction with the policy of the Supreme Commander. The damage wasn't just political, it was strategic. The entire moral authority of the American occupation rested on the premise that the United States was in Germany to dismantle the regime that had started the war and built the camps, not to cut deals with its surviving members. Patton had just told the world, on the record, that he didn't think that mission mattered. In Washington, the reaction was volcanic. The White House, already dealing with the fallout from the Harrison report on displaced persons, now had to explain why one of its most senior generals in Europe was publicly contradicting the occupation's foundational policy. In Moscow, Soviet propaganda outlets seized on the statement as proof that the Western Allies had never been serious about dismantling fascism. In London, the British press reported the story with the kind of restrained astonishment reserved for a senior ally doing something inexplicable. And in every occupied German city, where former party members were watching to see which way the wind blew, Patton's sentence landed with the force of policy. Not because it was policy, but because a 4-star general had said it out loud. And this is where the observation has to be made, because it's the one that explains everything that came before and everything that followed. Patton's tactical judgment on a battlefield was extraordinary, fast, intuitive, aggressive, almost always right. Patton's political judgment was non-existent. And the tragedy, if that's the word, is that Patton himself never understood there was a difference. He treated a press conference the way he treated a river crossing. Say what needs to be said, hit hard, don't apologize, move on. On a battlefield, that instinct made him the best armored commander in the war. In a press room, it made him a catastrophe. The skills didn't transfer, they never had. And Patton, at 60, wasn't going to learn the difference. Eisenhower had protected him from that blindness for 3 years, through the slapping, through Knutsford, through a dozen smaller eruptions that never made the papers. Eisenhower had absorbed the damage, smoothed the politics, kept the most valuable weapon in his arsenal pointed at the enemy instead of at itself. Now the enemy was gone, and the weapon was pointed directly at Eisenhower's own policy. 6 days later, the phone would ring. September 28, 1945, the IG Farben building in Frankfurt, the administrative headquarters of the American occupation, a massive concrete complex that had once housed the chemical conglomerate whose subsidiaries had manufactured the gas used in the regime's extermination camps. Eisenhower's office was on the upper floors. Patton had been summoned. The meeting wasn't a surprise. Patton knew what was coming. He'd been through enough confrontations with Eisenhower to recognize the rhythm, the formal summons, the careful scheduling, the presence of Bedell Smith as both witness and enforcer. What Patton didn't know, or refused to accept, was that this time the meeting wouldn't end with a reprimand and a second chance. Eisenhower, Patton, and Bedell Smith, 3 men in a room, 2 of them bound by a friendship that stretched back decades, the third present to ensure that friendship didn't derail what needed to happen. The details of the exchange were never transcribed word for word. No stenographer was present, and the accounts that survive come from the participants and their immediate staff. What is documented is that the meeting was heated. Voices were raised. Patton pushed back. Eisenhower held firm. And at some point during the confrontation, Eisenhower told Patton directly, in words that multiple sources have recorded, "George, you have broken the back of our policy." That sentence landed differently than anything Eisenhower had ever said to Patton before. After Sicily, Eisenhower's reprimand had been private, measured, almost fatherly, stern disappointment from a friend who still believed the friendship was worth preserving. After Knutsford, the anger had been sharper. The cable drafting Patton's relief had actually been written, and the decision to hold it back had been a close call. Those had been corrections. This was a verdict. Eisenhower then made what he carefully described as a suggestion. The 15th Army, really nothing more than a small headquarters and a staff of officers, had been formed to compile the official history of the war in Europe. It was an important job, Eisenhower insisted. It needed a good commanding general. He asked Patton to take it. The framing was deliberate. Eisenhower didn't order Patton to relinquish the Third Army. He didn't use the word relieved. He presented the transfer as a lateral move, a prestigious assignment, a recognition of Patton's value in a different capacity. Eisenhower even insisted it was an important job, and in a narrow bureaucratic sense, it was. Somebody had to compile the lessons of the largest military campaign in American history. Eisenhower told Patton the 15th needed a good commanding general, and he was asking Patton to be that general. The tone, by multiple accounts, was quiet, almost gentle. The knife went in soft. Everyone in the room understood what it actually was. The 15th Army had no troops. It had no tanks. It had no front line, no mission orders, no operational authority. Its headquarters was a hotel in Bad Nauheim. Its purpose was paperwork. Eisenhower was handing his oldest friend a desk and calling it a command. Patton understood immediately. According to accounts from those who spoke with him afterward, Patton was, in Merle Smith's words, very calm and very humble during the remainder of the meeting. The man who'd raged at Montgomery, who'd slapped privates, who'd told reporters exactly what he thought of Allied policy. That man sat in Eisenhower's office and accepted his reassignment without a fight. There was no eruption, no profanity, no threat to resign on the spot. Just a 4-star general absorbing the fact that his career, in every meaningful sense, was over. After the meeting, there was no customary dinner, no drinks, no reminiscence, no attempt to salvage the evening with the kind of camaraderie that had defined their relationship through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. Patton rode Eisenhower's train back to Bad Tölz. Shortly after, the two attended a football game together in Frankfurt, a previously scheduled event that neither cancelled, and during which Patton cloaked his bitterness behind the forced civility of a man who'd decided not to make a scene. At dinner later that evening, away from Eisenhower, Patton told his aide, Major Van S. Merle Smith, one sentence that captured the entire situation in 9 words. "I've just been fired by the best friend I ever had." And then, alone with Merle Smith, the composure cracked. Patton told his aide he wanted to resign from the army entirely, go home, leave the service, and say publicly everything he'd been ordered to keep quiet. He wanted to tell America about the Soviets, about what he believed was happening in Eastern Europe, about every strategic decision he thought Eisenhower and Washington had gotten wrong. Merle Smith talked him out of it. The aide pointed out that a resignation under these circumstances would look like a tantrum, not a principled stand, and that Patton's enemies would use it to bury whatever reputation he had left. Patton listened. He didn't resign. That night, or very close to it, Patton opened his diary and wrote a sentence that reads like a man staring at a wall. "I guess there is nothing left for me but the Undertaker." 2 days later, on September 30th, Bedell Smith made it official. Lieutenant General Lucien K. Truscott Jr., Patton's old comrade, the man who'd taken Messina for him in Sicily, who'd commanded the 6th Corps at Anzio, and later the 5th Army in Italy, would assume command of the 3rd Army. The transition was set for October 7th. Now, somewhere between the meeting in Frankfurt and the diary entry about the Undertaker, a different kind of general might have paused and asked a question that Patton never asked. Why this time? Why not another reprieve? Why did Eisenhower save him in 43 and 44 and let him fall in 45? And if you look at the 3 incidents side by side, the slapping, Knutsford, and now Bavaria, the answer isn't about friendship. The friendship hadn't changed. Eisenhower's affection for Patton, his genuine admiration for what Patton could do on a battlefield, his personal loyalty, all of that was intact right up to the meeting in Frankfurt. The letters Eisenhower wrote after the war make that clear. In Crusade in Europe, published in 48, Eisenhower praised Patton's extraordinary driving power and called him indispensable during the pursuit across France. What changed wasn't the friendship. What changed was the math. In 43, Eisenhower needed Patton for the invasion of France. The cost of keeping him, the political damage from the slapping scandal, the congressional inquiries, the press backlash was real, but the cost of losing him was higher. The math worked in Patton's favor. In 44, Eisenhower needed Patton for the breakout from Normandy. The cost of keeping him, the diplomatic fallout from Knutsford, the fury from Marshall and Stimson, was worse than before, but the invasion couldn't afford to lose its most aggressive armored commander 6 weeks before D-Day. The math again worked. In 45, there was no invasion, there was no breakout, there was no Rhine crossing, no Bastogne, no sprint across France. There was an occupation, a purge program, a displaced persons crisis, and a fragile alliance with Moscow that the entire post-war order depended on. Patton's tanks were irrelevant. Patton's mouth was the only thing still operational. And the math, for the first time, didn't work. Eisenhower didn't stop being Patton's friend in that office in Frankfurt. He stopped being able to afford him. The currency that had kept Patton alive, his value on a battlefield, had been devalued to zero by the surrender. And Eisenhower, who was many things but never sentimental about strategic calculations, did what the math required. When Patton walked out of the IG Farben building that afternoon, he left behind the only institution that had ever given his life meaning. The Third Army, 350,000 men, 4 corps, the most decorated American field army of the war, would pass to someone else's hands in 9 days. And George Patton, the man who'd driven it from the hedgerows of Normandy to the Czech border, would spend his remaining weeks in a hotel in Bad Tölz, supervising a staff of historians writing about battles other people had fought. October 7, 1945, a gymnasium in Bad Tölz, Bavaria. Rain outside. Inside, the flags of the Third Army and its 4 corps hung from the rafters. The corps' commanders had come, all 4 of them, because Patton had made it clear he wasn't leaving quietly. He didn't want Eisenhower, or anyone else, to think he'd slunk away. So the ceremony was full dress, honors rendered, the band in position, the staff assembled. Patton stood at the front of the gymnasium and addressed the men who'd served under him one last time. His speech was short. All good things must come to an end, he told them. The best thing that has ever happened to me thus far is the honor and privilege of having commanded the Third Army. No eruption, no profanity, no lecture about the Soviets, no parting shot at Eisenhower, no airing of grievances, just a 60-year-old general standing in a gymnasium on a rainy morning, saying goodbye to the only thing he'd ever loved doing. The band played Auld Lang Syne. Truscott, Lucien Truscott, who'd stormed the beaches at Anzio, who'd chased the Germans up the Italian peninsula, who'd taken Messina for Patton back in Sicily 2 years ago, stepped forward and received the colours. The Third Army now belonged to someone else. Patton saluted, walked out, got in his car. He drove to Bad Tölz. The 15th Army's headquarters was the Grand Hotel, a spa resort, comfortable enough, with the quiet that comes from having nothing urgent to do. Patton's new command consisted of a handful of officers and a filing operation. Their job was to compile tactical and operational reports from the European campaign, to interview commanders, gather documents, and write up the lessons of battles that were already over. There were no troops to review, no armor to inspect, no maps spread across tables with blue and red arrows pushing toward objectives. The hallways smelled like carpet cleaner, not diesel fuel. The loudest sound on any given morning was a typewriter. Patton tried, he attended briefings, he read reports, he gave directions to the staff, and within weeks, by every account, the interest drained out of him completely. The man who'd once driven 200 miles in a single day to reach the front, who'd personally scouted crossing points on the Moselle, who'd shown up at division command posts at 3 in the morning demanding to know why an attack had stalled, was now sitting behind a desk in a resort hotel, reviewing somebody else's after-action reports about a war that was already in the past tense. Patton wrote to Beatrice. He wrote in his diary. The entries from those final weeks carry the flat tone of a man who'd run out of things to push against. If you'd read only the diary from October and November of 45 with no name attached, you wouldn't have guessed the author was the same person who dictated those furious electric field orders during the race across France. Patton had spent his entire adult life building himself into a weapon, studying cavalry tactics at Fort Riley, redesigning the Army's saber, commanding tanks in the Meuse-Argonne, training armored divisions in the California desert, driving the 7th Army across Sicily, driving the 3rd Army across France and Germany. Every decision, every assignment, every risk had pointed in one direction. The next war, the next command, the next fight. And now there was nothing. No war, no command, no fight. Just a hotel, a stack of papers, and the slow realization that the world had moved on without him. There's a particular kind of ruin that only happens to people who are very good at exactly one thing. They don't fade. They don't retire gracefully. They stand in the exact spot where their skills used to matter, and the ground moves out from under them. Patton couldn't do diplomacy, couldn't do politics, couldn't do the patient, unglamorous work of rebuilding a shattered country. The only thing he could do, command men in combat, move fast, hit hard, take ground, was the one thing nobody needed anymore. And he couldn't become someone else. Not at 60, not ever. On December 9th, 1945, Patton's staff car collided with a US Army truck on a road outside Mannheim. Patton suffered a broken neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21st, he stopped breathing at the military hospital in Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. They buried him on Christmas Eve at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Hamm, row upon row of white crosses on a hillside, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army who hadn't made it home. Patton had asked to be buried with his men. It was the last order anyone followed.